Welcome back, everyone. It is Mike from ManaHoarders bringing you another episode of Let Them Fight. In this episode, we have Dustin running Ayula, Queen Among Bears, Nick playing Wulfgar of Icewind Dale, Damien playing Ramos, Dragon Engine, and I am running Miirym, Sentinel Worm. I hope you enjoy. Dustin wins the die roll and goes first. He draws for turn, he plays a snow-covered forest, and he passes the turn over to Nick. Nick draws for turn, plays his basic forest, and passes the turn to Damien. Damien draws his card for turn. He plays a Stomping Grounds and decides that he would rather it come in tapped, and passes the turn over to me. I draw for turn, I play an Evolving Wilds, and then I tap it and sacrifice it to search for a basic land card and pass the turn to Dustin while I search. Dustin starts his turn. He plays another snow-covered forest, then he taps both of his forests to cast his commander, Ayula, Queen Among Bears, and then he passes the turn over to Nick. Nick plays a basic mountain for turn. He taps both of his lands to put down a Thought Vessel, then he passes the turn over to Damien. Damien puts down a Breeding Pool tapped and then passes the turn to me. For my turn, I put down an Unclaimed Territory, choosing Dragon as the creature type. I tap that Unclaimed Territory for a green and my island to put down a Scaled Nurturer before passing it over to Dustin. Dustin plays a Sanctum of Eternity, then he taps all three of his lands to put down a Vivien, Champion of the Wilds. He upticks Vivien to give Ayula Vigilance and Reach until his next turn. Moving to combat, he leaves it up to a roll of the dice, and Nick is the one getting attacked by Ayula. Nick takes the 2 damage, and Dustin passes the turn. Nick plays a Mountain for turn. He taps all of his lands and his Thought Vessel to put down Anger, and then passes the turn over to Damien. Damien plays his 3rd land, which also enters tapped, before passing the turn over to me. I play a Mountain for turn. I tap my Scaled Nurturer, the Mountain, and the Unclaimed Territory to put down a Rhythm of the Wild, before passing it over to Dustin. Dustin starts things off by playing an Oran Reef tapped. He upticks Vivien, Champion of the Wilds to give Ayula Vigilance and Reach. Then he moves to combat. As he leaves the roll up to the Dice Gods once again, they decide that I will be getting attacked by Ayula. He swings in, and with no blocks, I move to take damage. Before damage is dealt, he flashes in a Bear Cub, giving Ayula 2 +1/+1 counters, and dealing 2 extra damage to me. I take the 4 damage before Dustin passes it over to Nick. Nick pays 3 to put down Domri, Anarch of Bolas. Nick uses Domri's -2 ability to make Anger fight Ayula, causing Anger to die in the process and go to his graveyard, right where he wanted him. He then passes it to Damien. Damien starts things off by paying all 3 of his mana to put down a Kodama's Reach. He reveals 2 basic swamps, putting one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into his hand before passing the turn. I play a Forest for turn. I use the Sand Augury ability from the Young Blue Dragon to scry 1 and then draw a card. I keep the card on top and then draw it and then pass the turn over to Dustin. Dustin upticks Vivien once again, giving Ayula Vigilance and Reach, and then he swings at Damien. Damien takes 4 damage, and then Dustin passes the turn over to Nick. Activating Domri's ability, Nick adds a green to his mana pool. He then taps 4 more and puts down his commander, Wulfgar of Icewind Dale, and then he passes it over to Damien. Damien plays a Swamp for turn. He then taps 4 mana to put down Nick of Bolas. When he enters the battlefield, each of us have to discard a card, and then Damien passes the turn. I play my land for turn. I then tap all of my land and my Scaled Nurturer to cast my commander, Miirym, Sentinel Worm, from my command zone. He enters, and my Rhythm of the Wild triggers, and I decide to put a +1/+1 counter on my commander before passing the turn over to Dustin. Before my turn ends, Dustin taps 4 and he flashes in his striped bears, drawing him a card and putting 2 extra counters on Ayula. He goes to tap his Oran Reef to put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature that entered the battlefield this turn, but decides against it as it would also pump up my commander. Dustin once again activates Vivien, Champion of the Wilds, giving Ayula Vigilance and Reach. He moves to combat and swings at me with Ayula, and at Damien with his Striped Bears and Bear Cub. I declare no blocks, and Damien moves to block the Bear Cub with his Nicobolas. Before damage is dealt, Dustin taps all 6 of his mana to flash out Vigor, preventing the damage that will be dealt to Bear Cub, and giving it 4 +1/+1 counters. The damage is finally dealt, and Dustin passes the turn over to Nick. Nick activates Domri for a green, and then taps 3 more mana to put down Delina, Wild Mage. He then taps 2 more to cast Rampant Growth. Moving to combat, Nick sends Wulfgar at Damien, which Damien decides to take the damage. Nick then passes the turn over to Damien. Damien plays a basic Swamp for turn. Having had enough of being walloped by Nick and Dustin, Damien tries to strike a deal with me, which I accept. He pays 5 mana and plays Crux of Fate, destroying all non-dragon creatures. All non-dragon creatures move to the graveyards, and Damien swings at Dustin's Planeswalker with his Nicobolas. The damage is dealt, and Damien passes the turn. To start my turn, I play a basic island. I then tap 5 mana and put down Terror of the Peaks. Since it is a non-token creature, it will have Riot from the Rhythm of the Wild, so I give it a 1/1 counter. Since it entered, it triggered my commander, so I get a copy of the Terror of the Peaks. The token copy enters the battlefield, and thus it triggers the first Terror of the Peaks. I deal this damage to Dustin's Planeswalker. And since Scaled Nurturer was tapped to cast a dragon spell, I gain 2 life. Moving to combat, I crack back at Dustin with my commander for 7 damage before passing the turn. Dustin pays 4 and casts a Skyshroud Claim, searching his library for 2 forests, which he puts onto the battlefield. He then taps his 4 untapped lands to recast his commander and passes the turn over to Nick. Nick uses Domri to add a red mana, and then he taps out to recast his commander Wulfgar from his command zone. Moving to combat, he swings Wulfgar right at Damien for 6 damage. Damien takes the 6, and Nick passes the turn. Damien plays his land for turn. He then taps 6 mana to cast his commander Ramos, Dragon Engine, from his command zone. Moving to combat, Damien swings his Nicobolas at Nick's Planeswalker. Nick's Planeswalker dies, and Damien passes the turn. To start things off, I cast Preordain so I can scry 2 and then draw a card. I decide to put both cards on the bottom and draw, but unfortunately don't find much that can help me. I then pay 5 mana and cast my Young Blue Dragon from exile, which will enter with a 1/1 counter because of the Rhythm of the Wild. Since my commander is on the battlefield, I create a token copy of the Young Blue Dragon. I also gain 2 life since I used my Scaled Nurturer to cast it. and then both of my Terror of the Peaks trigger. Using the damage from the first one that entered, since it is technically a 4/4, I deal 4 damage to Wulfgar. And for the 4 damage that came from the second Terror of the Peaks, I destroy Dustin's Ayula. I then resolve the trigger from the token copy of the Adult Blue Dragon entering, and I deal 3 damage to Nick and 3 damage to Dustin. Moving to combat, I swing both of my Terror of the Peaks at Nick, and I swing my Commander at Dustin. They have no creatures to block, so the damage is dealt, and then I pass the turn. Dustin pays 3 and casts Crow's Grip, targeting my Rhythm of the Wild. Since it has Split Second, I'm unable to respond, and Rhythm of the Wild is destroyed, and then Dustin passes the turn. Nick taps 3 and puts down Lelia, the Blade Reforged. Having no blocks, Nick moves to combat and swings at Dustin. He exiles the top card off of Lelia's ability, and then actually pumps her up to a 3/3, so Dustin takes 3 damage. In his second main phase, he pays 2 to cast Sword of the Animist, then he pays 2 to equip it onto Lelia before passing the turn. Damien starts his turn off by playing his land. He taps 3 mana to cast a Commander Sphere, and he passes the turn. I play a Forest for turn, and without much to cast, I move straight to combat. I send Terror of the Peaks at Nick, and I send my Commander at Dustin. In response, Dustin taps 2 and he casts Constant Mists, preventing all combat damage that will be dealt this turn. With nothing else, I pass the turn. Here we see Dustin tap 5 and cast Creeping Renaissance, choosing Creature as his permanent type. The Creeping Renaissance resolves, and he gets Vigor, Bear Cub, and Striped Bear back from his graveyard. He then pays 4 to cast these Striped Bears that he just got back. It enters the battlefield and he draws a card, then he passes the turn. Nick casts no spells in his main phase, so he moves straight to combat. He swings Lelia at Damien, and she is a 4/4, but from her own ability, she pumps up to a 5/5. Damien decides to take the damage, and Nick exiles the top card of his library. He is able to cast that exiled card until the end of his turn, which he does. He pays 7, and he puts down Bane of Balaged before passing the turn over to Damien. In Damien's main phase, he taps 7, but in fact he does not cast any spells. He instead flips his Nicol Bolas creature and turns it into its Planeswalker version. He then uses the +2 ability on Nicol Bolas to draw 2 cards before passing the turn. Moving to combat, I make sure to send at least 20 powers worth of dragons at Dustin, and with no blocks, he is knocked out of the game. Following combat, I then pass the turn to Nick. We see Nick pay 3 to put down Garruk's Uprising, drawing a card as it enters. Before Nick moves to combat, I cast Resculpt, targeting his Bane of Balaged. The creature is exiled and he creates a 4/4 red and blue elemental creature token. Still in his first main phase, Nick casts a Mage Slayer. Then he pays the mana to equip it to Lelia. Moving to combat, Nick once again swings at Damian with Lelia, who is now a 6/6. Damian takes the 6 direct damage from the Mage Slayer trigger. Then he decides to block Lelia with Ramos, who dies and goes back to his command zone. And with that, Nick passes the turn. To start things off, Damian taps a land. Then he taps another one. Then he taps another land. Then he moves some around. Then he finally casts Mirari's Wake. He then taps one of his lands for 2 blue mana to cast Snapcaster Mage. It enters and he targets the Crux of Fate in his graveyard. He then taps his remaining mana to cast the Crux of Fate, destroying my last ounce of hope and all dragon creatures. He then uses the -3 ability on his Nicobolas Planeswalker to deal 10 damage to Lelia. After a very explosive turn, he decides to pass. For my turn, I play a land. I pay 8 mana and then recast my commander before passing it over to Nick. For Nick's turn, he taps enough mana to put down a Drakuseth Maw of Flames, which will enter with haste since he has Anger in his graveyard. He draws a card from the Garruk's Uprising trigger. Then he pays 2 mana to equip Drakuseth with the Sword of the Animist. Moving to combat, Nick swings Drakuseth directly at the Nicobolas Planeswalker. He deals 3 damage to the Snapcaster Mage, 4 damage to Damian's face, and 3 damage to my face. He then passes the turn to Damian, who untaps with a Mirari's Wake and a ton of land. After much contemplation, he decides to tap 8 and recast his commander. At this point, Nick remembers the Sword of the Animist trigger, so we let him go search for his land. Damian taps up to the total 7 mana needed to cast Cyclonic Rift Overloaded, bouncing my board and Nick's board back to our hands. With nothing else, he passes the turn. I untap, I play a tapped Stomping Grounds. I tap 6 mana to recast my commander once again, and then I pass the turn over to Nick. First things first, on Nick's turn he recasts his Drakuseth from his hand. He then pays 3 to recast the Garruk's Uprising, drawing a card as it enters. Moving to combat, Nick swings the Drakuseth at me. He sends 4 damage directly to me, 3 damage to Damian, and 3 to Ramos, and then after that I declare no blocks and take the additional 7 from Drakuseth. Nick passes the turn over to Damian. We see Damian tap 8 mana and put down a Maelstrom Wanderer, cascading twice as it enters. From the first cascade trigger, he reveals a Farseek, casting it for free and going to get the land. From the second cascade trigger, he reveals a Mizzix's Mastery from the top of his library, and when he casts it, he targets a Boros Charm from his graveyard. He casts the Boros Charm and decides to give Ramos double strike until the end of the turn. Moving to combat, Damian swings his double striking Ramos at Nick, who has no blockers, and he takes enough lethal commander damage to be knocked out of the game. In his second main phase, Damian taps 7 and casts a Nicobolus God Pharaoh Planeswalker. He uses the +1 ability, and I exile the only 2 cards I had left in my hand. Unfortunately for me, one of the cards I exiled was a red dragon, which upon entering the battlefield on my next turn would have won me the game. Damian passes the turn and I untap. I pay 4 mana and cast a Distant Melody choosing dragon, so I can draw 1 card. I tap my remaining 7 mana and cast a Thunder Dragon, which creates a token of itself whenever it enters, dealing 3 damage to each creature that does not have flying. Both of the Thunder Dragons enter the battlefield, dealing 6 damage to the Maelstrom Wanderer, destroying it. I then move to combat and swing my commander at Damian. Having no blocks, I think that he is completely helpless, until he taps both of his mana for 4 total mana and casts an Aetherize, sending my commander back to my hand again. With nothing else, I pass my turn. To get things started, Damian taps 8 total mana, being sure to include at least 1 of each color to cast a Conflux. For the cards that he has searched for, he reveals Cruel Ultimatum, Negate, Golgari Charm, Narset Transcendent, and last but not least, he reveals a Torment of Hailfire. He puts those 5 cards into his hand, and then immediately moves to cast the Torment of Hailfire. He taps his Swamp for the 2 black needed from the casting cost, then dumps everything else he has available into the X, also activating Ramos' ability to give him 10 additional mana, which he also dumps into the X for a total of 21. As the Torment of Hailfire resolves, I sacrifice both of my creatures, discard my commander, and then promptly die. And just like that, Damian and Ramos take the win. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, tell your friends about us, and leave a comment down below. Let us know what commanders you would like to see face off in the future. I really appreciate all of your support.